A lot of the question marks that we have touched upon in our 3 sessions so far, and as far as the path covered, the common thread is that of infrastructural challenges, balancing infrastructure with e-mobility, and that, of course, is a challenging task that lies ahead. Boosting investment in charging infrastructure is the immediate priority here, as we've just discussed. What are the long-term infrastructural challenges posed by the switch to a green commute, the switch to electric vehicles in our country? Inviting on stage our panelists for session number 4, Simon Morse, Managing Director, Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Appreciate very much you joining us, sir. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Nikhil Sanghi, Chairman, Automotive Skill Development Council, ASDC, and MD and founder, JS4 Wheel Motors Private Limited. Appreciate very much, sir, you're joining us and sparing your time. Anthony Say, Executive Director, Galaxy Lithium, is also with us here. And Mr. Arun Malhotra, former MD Nissan India, with us as well for session number 4. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thank you, Mali. I think we have come to the most important part of our e-mobility summit. I think I would call it the brass tacks session, because you have nothing when you don't have infrastructure. Where do you run the car? How do you run the car? Unless and until the infrastructure is good, defined, dense, populated, cost-effective, it is only then a product is successful. And I would like to throw open this question to all the distinguished guests, starting from you. What's the basic infrastructure requirement when it comes to India in context of e-vehicles, which we are lacking, which needs to be augmented, which needs to be worked upon?
So I might have changed the theme of this a bit, but the basic thing that India is lacking is lithium-ion batteries. I know we're talking about the infrastructure and plug-in and charging infrastructure, but the core thing to everything we've talked about today is the lithium-ion battery. So let me be very clear. We're in the midst of a global battery arms race right now. The world is building out these lithium-ion battery mega factories, of which 71 are in China. None are in India. And for me, to build available, low-cost lithium-ion batteries and the infrastructure for that supply chain is the crucial factor for India right now.
Mr. Sanghi, what do we need to do to augment ourselves when it comes to the business of batteries? Because that's the heart of an electronic vehicle.
So I think first we need to understand that the basic component of lithium is not just there in India. So we will need to import lithium. And 2, an investment in cell manufacturing is a huge capital intensive incentive. It cannot be done on small scale. So I think what we need to plan is plan very big, and unless we plan it very big, and unless we don't assemble lithium batteries, but we actually manufacture lithium batteries in India, there is no solution, there is no shortcut.
How do we do that? What needs to be done? What needs to be in place?
So I think first we need to understand that I think one of the things that we started with EVs was, are we going to substitute our import bill in terms from oil? Because I think one of the reasons which the government started talking of EVs was environment, which was pollution. The other thing that they talked about was that we have a huge import bill in terms of oil, and we need to replace that. I think the panel before us talked about each and every component which goes into an EV is imported. And when it comes to battery manufacturing, I think we do not have time to develop technology. If the time frame which the government is talking about is 2023, 2025, 3-wheelers and 2-wheelers, we will need to import technology, and it will not come cheap. So we need to definitely first agree that it's going to be a big investment and a big foreign component investment that India will need to make if we need to become big in gigabyte batteries.
Mr. Sanghi, is the issue of infrastructure limited to batteries, or is it also about the charging points? Is it about our dependence on electricity, which is primarily being derived from fossil fuels? Because ultimately, when we talk about electronic vehicles, we say, well, it creates a smart and a green city. But then if you take electricity, it's coming from the fossil fuel. It's back to one. It's not like Scandinavia where energy is being harnessed from sea.
So I think you're right. You're absolutely right, because since we started with batteries, I was talking about batteries. But I'll come to even smaller basics. And so I think the adoption happened at the low end, where we talked of e-rickshaws. And what e-rickshaws are using in India are not lithium-ion batteries, but the normal lead-acid batteries. And to charge lead-acid batteries, you do not require very expensive infrastructure. The existing infrastructure, you can actually charge those batteries at home. But as soon as you switch to lithium-ion, then the present electric infrastructure available at home is not good enough. You will require a 3-phase, well-earthed electrical connection to do a lithium-ion charge. And if you don't, you'll actually damage the battery. So at the low end, if you start talking of even three-wheelers, the kinds which Mahindra Electric is making, the Trio and the Yari, for those, and they use lithium-ion batteries, you will require good electrical and 3-phase, properly earthed infrastructure, which unfortunately is not there as far as the users are concerned, the people who will be using those three-wheelers. So I think a proper electric charging infrastructure, both in terms of penetration, in terms of quantity, and in terms of quality, are a precondition to introducing EVs in India.
Mr. Malhotra, coming to you, how can we define the current ecosystem of infrastructure? If I have to say, please define it for us, where does it stand? Is it healthy?
So if you look at let's look at the vision statement, which China follows and which we also want to follow, is that if you have to have EVs available, every 3 kilometers in this urban area, there should be a charging station.
Every 3 kilometers?
Every 3 kilometers. And every 25 kilometers on a highway. Now, India's area is 3.2 million square kilometers. We have, to the latest count, if I remember, 160 charging stations. So we are like carbon dioxide, 0.03%. Now, it's a vicious circle. If you don't have the EV charging infrastructure, the confidence doesn't come in. It's surprising, and it's also sad, that what number of EV cars we have sold last year was lower than the previous year. And probably this year will not be higher than the last year. So we are getting into a vicious circle, although there are a lot of moves in the past, and I think the government strategy is to focus more on commercial vehicles where you have dedicated routes, or also three-wheelers where charging time, or two-wheelers where the amount you drive is lesser. But the point is that confidence, ultimately the customer has to buy it. You may give him subsidy. First of all, there's a limit to a subsidy, how much you can give. Or you have some strict policy which China followed. So it's a problem area. There have been a lot of, the last few months, I think 2 months back, there was a government tender which has come up for charging stations. And the way I feel it, rather than capturing or trying to do everything across the country, across 29 states, 27 states and 9 union territories, focus on 2-3 cities, which are geographically compact, where you can do it. The proof of concept comes in, the learning comes in, and you do it. Unfortunately, we are trying to do it at many places. Every state has a government different EV policy. Bengal announced its EV policy, Karnataka has an EV policy. So there's a lot of confusion which is coming in. There is a budget there. So there are something centrally driven in infrastructure, unless it is driven, monitored, regulated, and also communicated for customer confidence.
So you're saying basically we require a very focused approach.
Focused approach and transparent approach. Today, I don't know in Delhi, a normal person, where is the charging infrastructure? If there is any, even that also is like a Swiss bank secret. So that's something, a transparency which you require, and you require a clear roadmap. I want to capture these 10 cities, this is the way I want to do. That will inspire confidence between all the stakeholders.
Or is it about transforming behavior? Because I remember in 1980s when Maruti 800 came, the discussion in the neighborhood would be, it does not have the strength of an Ambassador or a Fiat, it can be crumpled like a match. So, people would say, no, it does not have that integrity. Or, for example, when the CNG was introduced in Delhi, people would say, why would you buy CNG? Do you want to waste 3 hours in front of a station? So is it about transforming behavior? Product requires a new way of perceiving it.
So how do you transform behavior? I was in the auto industry that time, and this was a question asked, can Maruti 800 go up? It was tried out along with the Fiat and tried out in Kedarnath and Badrinath the par-to-weight ratio of Maruti 800 was better and you could navigate better on closed surface. So do we have this proof of concept? Because ultimately a proof of concept has to be shown, tried out, and then the behavior can change. Behavior will not change overnight without this, without any proof of concept being shown and proven successfully.
Anthony, I would like...
I was just talking
yes,
about...
Mr.
So since you talked of CNG and since Arun talked of CNG, I think we've been in CNG for over 15 years now. And I do not understand, we still have a 2-kilometer queue out of every CNG station. And you cannot be a personal owner and wait for 3 hours to get your CNG. If we have not been able to create an infrastructure for CNG dispensing, I wonder if we'll be able... It has to be ease. It has to be convenient.
And
it has
CNG
to be
is
usable.
not national. CNG is limited to cities and the pipeline.
Are we saying that, apart from the normal combustible engines, we have not been able to create infrastructure for newer technologies when it comes to two-wheelers and automobiles? Starting with you.
Sure. Galaxy, for those of you who aren't familiar with the company, we are a lithium producer. And we're the 5th largest lithium producer in the world. We have producing mines in Australia, projects in Argentina, and Canada. And we predominantly sell into the Chinese market, Japanese and Korean market. So probably I'll take this opportunity just to share some perspectives from the Chinese market in terms of how it's evolved in the last 5 to 10 years. The current charging infrastructure in China at the moment is about, just last month, 2 months ago, hit over 1 million charge points. So China currently, as of today, first half of this year, probably about 3.5 million stock in terms of vehicles. That's closing on 4 million as we speak right now. So the ratio of charging stations to vehicles is about 3.5 to 1. Okay, and these are full EV charging stations. These are not e-bike charging stations. So the development of your EV deployment strategy, and obviously in China they've had some very sensible and effective what I call carrot and stick policies. So there are incentives and subsidies to encourage OEMs. So there's 3 levels of what I call policy strategy. The first level is obviously at the provincial and municipal level. So every province and every municipality actually has a target to actually hit, and everyone has to sing from the same song sheet. But at the same time, the private sector, whether it's state-owned OEMs or it's private OEMs, have to hit certain targets. So this year, starting 2019, there is a double credit system, and a double credit system basically works as a carrot and a stick. So you're mandated to hit 10% of your production quota to produce NEVs. They call them new energy vehicles in China, and that's defined as anything that has a plug. So a Toyota Prius is not an NEV by Chinese definition. But at the same time, if the aggregate emissions, if you're a traditional OEM, if your aggregate emissions exceed a certain level, you also get punished and you actually have to buy green credits. So that is a carrot and a stick that's working. But at the same time, policy also is working at a consumer level. So there are a lot of licensing restrictions. So for example, if Simon lived in Shanghai, okay, and he wanted to buy a Range Rover, in order to buy the Range Rover, Simon would have to first fork out an equivalent of 90,000 renminbi, roughly. That's about $15,000 US, okay, just for the right to enter into a lottery. And that allows him to get into the lottery, but doesn't guarantee him the car. He then goes into a lottery, and the success rate, if Simon lived in Shanghai, would be about 2 to 3%. So for every 100 applicants to purchase a vehicle, only 2 or 3 are successful. So you kind of think, well, Simon's a rich guy. He's also very lucky as well. Okay? So he puts down his $15,000. He wins the lottery, walks into a showroom, okay, walks into a Range Rover or the Audi showroom and said, I want a big SUV. Said, Mr. Moores, you're very welcome. Here's your car. But by the way, your registration number can only restrict you to drive your ICE vehicle a certain number of days of the week. So if you have an odd number even plate, you can only drive it on odd days of the week. If you have an even number plate, you can drive it on an even day of the week. However, if this gentleman also lived in Shanghai, he wants to buy an EV, he wants to buy a BYD, or if he's even richer, he wants to buy a Tesla. He has none of these restrictions. So these are some of the different levels of policy that they've done. But the targets that are set for government are not just to hit fleet deployment strategies. So recently in June of this year, the main ministry of MIIT in China basically promulgated that essentially first-tier cities, and this is what this gentleman was saying earlier, it has to be a targeted policy for each tier of the city, because everyone's got very different challenges to face. And basically, municipal governments have to do a couple of things. One is, starting in 2019, they have to effect 40% of their public transportation fleets. And these include buses, minibuses, and taxis have to be electrified. For someone like BYD in Shenzhen, they've already beat that target by a mile. But for other cities, they have to work towards that. That percentage has to go to 80% in 2020. So 80% of all public transportation, you can imagine you set a target like that in Delhi. How hard or how easy would that be to hit? But last but not least, the charging stations that I mentioned, that 1 million charge points that you see in China today, it's a mix of about 60-40, public versus private. So you have private estate and apartment complexes which will have their charge points, but you also have a lot of public, and the public are basically going to be funded by municipal governments. So China has a policy of not only this at the federal, at the state level, at the central level, to allocate a certain amount of policy-driven subsidy and rebates, but they're also asking the private sector to come up with a check as well. So it's a partnership between the public and the private sector in order to build this industry.
Yes. I think it's a good point Anthony made. I mean, there is, for me, it's a chicken and egg situation. On the demand side, you've got customers, well, we want the charging infrastructure to buy EVs. Really, on the supply side, I think if EVs are cheap enough, people are going to buy them regardless. So in the UK, people have been buying pure electric vehicles regardless of the charging infrastructure. We've been pretty slow. London's okay, the rest of the country is terrible. I've got a question for Anthony. What was China? What came first, the EV or the infrastructure?
Actually, the EV came first. So we talked about behaviors and habits a little bit earlier. And a lot of people think, well, I need cost parity and I need performance parity versus an ICE vehicle. The lesson that China has taught us in terms of what Simon and I have observed in China over the last 3 or 4 years is that EV consumers, at least the first generation of EV consumers, do not think that they behave exactly like ICE consumers. Okay? Especially if you're in your mid-20s, you're looking to buy your first private vehicle, right? If you want to buy an EV, you have no restrictions. If you want to buy an ICE vehicle, you have all of these monetary and driving restrictions. Okay? But if you want to buy a car, you want to be able to drive it. And I'll talk about e-bikes in a moment as well. But if you think about it, if you've never owned a car, you have no concept of, well, how come my car only does 400k or 500? Why can't it do 600k? If you go into a showroom and the salesperson said, well, this car has a range of 150 to 200k, well, what do you do when you have your phone? You buy a phone, and when your phone battery runs down to more or less 10%, you go and charge it up. And so the behavior of EV consumers actually is very, very different. I'm a consumer myself. I drive a Tesla Model S P85D in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has a very high penetration, but the way that I drive and charge my Tesla is completely different from when I used to have an ICE vehicle. The ICE vehicle used to go all the way down to that red zone of the fuel gauge, and then I go and fill it up. When I drive my EV now, whenever I park in a shopping mall or outside a restaurant, if there's a free charging spot, I'll just go and top up. And the battery may be 85%, it may be 65%, or it could be 25%. So your behavior changes completely.
You know, Anthony, you have the experience of the foreign market. You know, when we talk about cars in Indian market, the cars or the purchase of a car is about a family. You know, first comes the family as a unit. Then you have individuals buying car primarily. So it's a decision it's like a consensus where the family decide which car to go for. So, you know, for ages, a particular car or particular brand of car was chosen. What in your experience, the EV, the behavior of the people in China and other dense market has been, are EVs the first choice of a consumer or it's the second car?
Well, if you have so many restrictions on buying a car full stop, do you want to buy the car or you don't want to buy a car? So whether or not you're a couple or you're a family, your decision is to have a piece of what I call individual mobility. That will allow you freedom to go out on the weekend, or you want to go down to Zhejiang province and sit by the lake and take the family there. And so the Chinese government has basically kind of got into the psyche of the consumer and said, well, if you want this personal freedom of having individual mobility, then the cost of doing that, if you want to have an ICE vehicle, is up here. But if you want to have an environmentally friendly and promotion of new technology vehicle, it's down here. And so that's why for a long time, just like India, this is one aspect that many Western counterparts, and I spend a lot of time debating this with Simon, don't understand about Asian markets. China probably has somewhere in the region of about 250 million e-bikes stock. Okay? 30 million e-bikes sold a year. Last year was about 6 million lithium-ion battery-based, and 8 million will be this year. So it's a decent, what's that? That's about 25% penetration lithium-ion battery. And when I was explaining to some of my Western industry peers about, hey, look, the e-bike market's it's very big, don't just look at the EV sector, you've also got the e-bike sector and the lithium-ion battery penetration. And then a lot of my Western friends say, well, why does everyone want to buy an e-bike? The thing is, what they don't realize is that back in the day when I first started working and living in China, so I was born in the UK and I went back many, many years ago. But a bicycle back in the day, everyone used to have a bicycle. And why everyone had a bicycle was because it was an upgrade from walking. And the natural transition for most of China was to upgrade from a bicycle, not to a car, but to an electric bike, which was historically lead-acid based. And so the personal freedom that you get from individual mobility is extremely powerful. It allows you to pick up more work. There's a very big informal economy, so it allows people to do that. And I think this is an aspect which the country of India has a huge potential on, is to pursue a very bespoke India-centric EV strategy, which I think should probably be more focused on 2- and 3-wheel vehicles initially. And over time, the 4-wheel vehicles will start to pick up as well.
Mr. Kumar, you had been talking about a focused approach, and I think the moot point which you raised in context of China was the carrot and stick policy. But can those choices, those hard rules can be implemented in India in terms of, if you do this, you will get this. If you buy this, you will not get this.
So, implementing something in China and implementing in India is different. India is a open democracy. Even to implement helmets in India, absolutely. 2-wheelers took 10 years. But the point which is coming, I think, which really came out, there is clear incentives which are there and which is substantial in the initial part, because the early adopters should get good incentives. That could be done. You can phase it out later. Second is disincentives. Do we have the political will or the muscle to implement disincentives, which China did?
Look what happened after Motor Vehicle Act.
Motor Vehicle Act, yeah. And third is the sweetener impact. Like London has in Zone 1, parking which is £10 per day. You have zero parking fee for London. That means you can save £3,000 just on parking in London if you're working in Zone 1. Or if you decide tomorrow that in Connaught Place in Delhi, in the inner circle and the outer circle, only EVs will be allowed. I'll tell you 100 people line up to buy an EV. Or near the cricket stadium, below 2 kilometers before, only EV can go inside. So then it becomes a status symbol. The point is to get it talking. So incentives, disincentives, and sweeteners, and then focused approach on certain markets. But one thing good the government has done is that government is very clear, and I think EVs, the route which India is following is that in commercial vehicles, the first one, because there the routes are very clear-cut. Charging, it's like Himachal Pradesh government has taken the lead, the biggest lead in EV buses. They've got about 80 buses, EV buses, running in Shimla or running from Shimla to neighboring cities. Then come to 3-wheelers and 2-wheelers where you have lesser anxiety on range or even the power of the charging. And then passenger vehicles, anyway we have put it on the back burner because only commercial application is allowed for any subsidy. So that's the route we need to take. But sweeteners we can definitely do. Disincentives, not the China method, but some way tightening the screw can happen.
Mr. Sanghi, before I come to you, Simon, there is one part of the whole debate of batteries is recycling them. That's the toughest part. What has been your Indian experience in terms of the infrastructure which exists, and what are the challenges here in India in terms of recycling lithium batteries?
Yeah, recycling has only really been discussed and evolved over the last 3 years globally. So the biggest challenge with recycling at the moment is...
Can they be recycled 100%? lithium batteries?
In theory, they can.
In theory?
In theory, they can.
And in practice?
The reality is it's very difficult to get all of the raw materials out. So the key thing for me on recycling is, first, can you get the supply of batteries? Second, do you know what's in the battery? What's the chemistry? So you know what are the minerals in there? Third, is there a market for those minerals? So the key raw materials are lithium, graphite, cobalt, nickel, and then you have some manganese as well. So you're 5. Now, for big battery recyclers, the biggest question is, you take lithium out of that battery, can you then use it back in the battery market, which is by far the biggest growing market for lithium? At the moment, no. So that's the challenge of recycling. Anthony's actually on the board of one battery recycling company.
What do you do with the batteries once the life is over?
There's two options. There's a second life for batteries. You can still reuse them in energy storage systems. This is for an electric vehicle battery. Or you have to break it down and get the raw materials out.
And what's the environmental impact?
Depends on the process.
Yes.
Yeah.
Depends on the process. So
what are the processes we are talking about then?
In recycling, you have different schools of processes. So normally you have a mechanical shredding and separation. And then, depending on the company, you'd have a pyrometallurgical process, which basically means you're burning the batteries. And by burning the batteries, you can normally extract your nickel and cobalt, but the issue is that inside a battery, you've got 4 main components. So you've got your cathode, your anode, your separator, and your electrolyte. So what tends to happen is when you actually burn a battery, you're also burning the electrolyte. The electrolyte is an LiPF6, and the F stands for fluorine. And fluorine is actually a very, very toxic gas. Okay, so what you do not want to be doing is creating that. So that has an environmental impact. But there are new processes which are now have evolved, and Simon and I met with some companies the other day in India who've developed a hydrometallurgical process which is much more environmentally friendly. Now, from a recycling perspective, you think about a component that goes into a battery. It's already gone through a very stringent process to refine the cathode material, the anode, and the graphite and everything else. So the quality of the raw materials inside the battery is actually very, very good. And there's good economics to actually extract that. Okay? The problem is that you've also got to deal with your copper, your aluminium, and your plastics, and those are reasonably saleable products. I mean, plastic is a slightly different issue, but we were very surprised when we met the company the other day that we said, okay, that's great. You can extract your lithium, you can produce lithium carbonate, you can extract your cobalt, you can produce your cobalt sulfate and your nickel sulfates. I said, well, okay, who do you sell to? Do you ship that back to the cathode producers in Asia? I said, yeah, well, I don't have a choice. I don't have anyone, and this comes back to Simon's point about the supply chain being non-existent in India. There's no one producing cells, and therefore no one producing cathode, anode, separator, or electrolyte. So these guys who are recycling lithium batteries in India, they're producing lithium salts, cobalt salts, and nickel salts. And guess what they're doing? They're sending the lithium to the pharmaceutical industry. They're sending the cobalt and the nickel to other industrial applications because there's no homegrown battery supply chain here.
Mr. Sanghi, that's a very relevant point he made. But the larger issue is that when we talk about the ingredients which go into the battery, they're also very finite in nature. You have lithium, the large reserves in Bolivia, the large reserves are in South America. Cobalt, maybe
the largest producer is not in Bolivia.
So the point is that what do you do when you know these reserves are finite? Does more innovation is required? Do we need to look at the future of electronic vehicles beyond lithium batteries? Is it on horizon?
So it's definitely on horizon. So there are a lot of chemistries that batteries are being worked upon, including sodium ion, iron ion, zinc ion. So, and I think those are the technologies which India should be focusing on because supplies of these are abundant in India and they are far more environmental friendly than lithium. The negative side is that it will require some amount of gestation period to develop these technologies, not just develop these technologies to make them commercially viable. But those are technologies which will probably make a much bigger and a longer commercial sense for India than lithium ion.
But then, Mr. Sanghi, before I come to you, the smooth functioning of EV infrastructure depends on your stable, cost-effective, and a profitable electricity grid. Now, that electricity grid, which is profitable, where there are minimum transmission losses, does not exist in India. So what do you think that work needs to be done before we start full throttle on e-platforms?
I don't think then we'll ever start. So we will have to make a start someday. And you asked a question, EVs first or infrastructure first, and he said EVs first. So I think we will need to do EVs first, and then we will need to work around in terms of, and you also rightly said that electricity, I think the biggest component of electricity comes from pet coke, which is the dirtiest form of fuel that you could use. So you will need to work there and replace pet coke with more environmentally friendly. So we will need to go nuclear, we'll need to go hydroelectric, we'll need to, so first our source of power needs to be far more cleaner than what it is today, but we will need to start somewhere. If we keep waiting for all these things, then let's just forget about EV in India.
But the most important of all, an issue which Anthony reflected upon, it's also about management of your e-waste. Because ultimately when you're talking about electronic vehicles, or it's like mobile phones, when we talk about mobile phones, it's also about management of e-waste. So do we have an infrastructure in context of e-vehicles and management of e-waste in India? And what are the issues which confront us today?
So we have not even started talking about those.
Anthony?
From my understanding, India has a very vibrant e-waste sector. But recycling a lithium battery is very, very different from PCBs, extracting copper and the gold out of PCBs, which is a very saleable product. Copper and gold is very, very saleable. The problem about extracting lithium is that you need to extract lithium to a certain level of specification in order to reuse and resell into the battery materials industry. And that requires a certain level of processing technologies. Now, I've met a couple of companies in my last couple of trips to Delhi and also to Bangalore so far who seem to be making some very good inroads here.
You're saying that you need specialized skill.
Yeah. So the processing technology around recycling lithium batteries is very much focused on chemical engineering, getting your flow sheet right in order to separate it. And in theory, you can actually achieve 95+% recovery of all of your material. So all of the material that goes to make a battery together, everything from inside the cell to outside the cell in the pack. The BMS is essentially a PCB, is a computer chipset. The pack is made of ABS plastic. All of that can actually be recycled. But the thing is that you do actually need to spend the effort and investment in terms of R&D to develop that process. Now, India, for the time being, still doesn't have a very, very large homegrown base of lithium-ion batteries. I mean, consumer electronics is very large, but the volume of consumer electronics in gigawatt hours is still very, very small. To put it in perspective, a Nissan Leaf, the first generation Nissan Leaf had 1,000 iPads in the Nissan Leaf. And then the current average Tesla Model 3 is probably three times the size of a Nissan Leaf. And then an e-bus is 3 times the size of a Tesla. So, although you may have a lot of consumer electronics here, it doesn't actually add up to that much volume. From a longer-term perspective, if we do want to see fruition in terms of India's EV strategy, I think ultimately they will have to go vertical up the value chain, how to become more self-sustaining in terms of kind of supply of their battery cells. At the moment, I believe that there's a lot of cells being imported, pack assembly being made here, but there's no reason why India cannot actually start cell assembly, cell manufacturing here.
And before I conclude the discussion, because we are falling short of time, do you think that in the time to come, in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, that the price of these batteries will go down, because that will ultimately make EV a very cost-effective platform?
Yeah, so at Benchmark we track the battery supply chain. We collect data from around the world, and battery cell costs is one of those data points. And 2014, no one cared about lithium-ion batteries. The cell cost is about $350 per kilowatt hour. Today, the average cost for automotive-grade large contract cells is $120 to $130 per kilowatt hour. If you're buying lithium-ion batteries into India and you're a relatively large company, you'll be getting them for the $160 to $180 mark. The point is, at a time when raw materials have gone through the roof, lithium and cobalt prices, the cost of batteries have been dropping. So the economics are absolutely on the side of lithium-ion batteries. But to Anthony's point, none of this is going to happen in India if you don't have your own battery cell manufacturing capacity. And that's the key point.
Okay, that's an important point. But closing comment from you, Mr. Sanghi. Do we have the robust regulatory framework for developing a very strong infrastructure for e-platforms?
Our problem is not having a robust regulatory system. Our problem is enforcing that regulatory system. Enforcement. So we probably have the most robust regulatory systems, but we have the weakest enforcement system, and I think that's what we need to correct.
I think this is the point on which we can sum up our discussion. But then, battery supply chain, whether we'll be the market or whether we'll probably will we be able to innovate in terms of design, other things will remain. But I think India can do well if, as very correctly pointed out Mr. Kumar, if we can target few cities, areas, use it as an experiment, transform behavior in a democratic way, I think then the e-platforms can be successful. I think the hard carrot and stick policies deployed in other democracies or limited democracies, I don't think can be a very successful arrangement in India. India is a very different form of a democracy. Molly.
Thanks very much, gentlemen.